Welcome to Global Connections with Robert Siegel, presented by the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center. Our monthly Leaders Forum addresses vital issues facing society, the economy, real estate, medicine, technology, and science. My name is Dr. Joshua Plow. I'm the Executive Director of American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, a 501c3 National American charitable organization based in New York City. We at AFRMC represent Israel's premier hospital, Rabin Medical Center in Petah Tikva and Greater Tel Aviv, the leading institution named in honor of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The hospital is a model of coexistence, as it serves 1 million patients annually from all ethnic and religious backgrounds with the same compassionate care. Please support our mission. Join our community of friends. Visit American Friends of Rabin Medical Center via our website and social media outlets on Twitter and Instagram, LinkedIn and YouTube, and on our Facebook page and discussion group. Today's Global Connections topic is extreme weather trends. Thank you to our very special guest, Elizabeth Kolbert, Pulitzer Prize author and staff writer at the New Yorker magazine, Dr. Gavin Schmidt, director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies, and Dr. Rachel Cleetus with the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And now, Global Connections with Robert Siegel.
Thank you, Josh. Here is the least newsworthy, most widely reported fact that I could possibly open one of our Global Connections panels with. The Earth's climate is warming, and the emissions of an industrialized world are at least a big part of what's causing it. This may be easy for me to say, but it's not at all easy for us to act on effectively. Flora and fauna turn up in higher latitudes in search of lower temperatures these days. Every year turns out to be one of the hottest years on record. Generations have grown up hearing this, but we've never made the moral equivalent of war the measure of our response to environmental developments. How bad is it? How is it happening? And what can be done, if anything? Those are big questions, and I think we have a panel of 3 experts who are well up to the task of answering them. We begin with Dr. Gavin Schmidt, who is a climatologist with NASA. He's director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York's Morningside Heights near Columbia University. His academic training was as a mathematician, and he's a climate modeler. He's also a blogger, co-founder of the blog Real Climate, Climate Science from Climate Scientists. Gavin Schmidt, thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
And I'd like to begin with for you to explain something elementary here, which is the distinction to be made between climate and weather, so that when we experience a summer that turns out to be less hot than usual or a winter that is colder than usual, we can reconcile that with a warming trend in the climate.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great place to start. The climate is the ensemble. It's the statistics, and I like to use an analogy of your wardrobe, right? So your wardrobe is the ensemble of all the things that you could be wearing today, but the one particular thing that you've chosen to wear today is a little bit random. You could have chosen that jacket or that sweater or this pair of trousers, but the choices that you have are somewhat constrained by what is in your cupboard. But over time, what goes on in your wardrobe, it can change. Somebody can come in, take out all your fraying shirts and put in a whole bunch of new shirts. And what we're seeing right now with climate change is that somebody is rearranging our wardrobe, and the choices that we have for what we're going to wear on a daily basis, the weather is shifting alongside that.
And how united are climate scientists on the statements that the climate is changing, the change is marked by global warming, and that human activity causes or at least contributes to the causes of that change?
Oh, we can actually go much further. I mean, we just had a report that came out this August. The conclusions of that report, which has been peer reviewed and written and argued over by thousands of scientists across the world, is that yes, the changes that we're seeing are unequivocal. There's no question that we've warmed by more than about 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the last 100 or so years, and that it is due to our activities. There's no question about that. You know, we've looked at all of the other possible changes of climate, the sun, the volcanoes, the wobbles in the Earth's orbit. But what it comes down to is that the increase in greenhouse gases has been pushing us warmer. We've done other things like increased pollution, chopped down forests, increased smog. All of those things have an effect as well. But the trends that we're seeing, you know, this warming that we keep talking about, it's all due to us.
And when you say 2 degrees Fahrenheit over a century or so, if we were to add another couple of degrees Fahrenheit, right, does that translate to it's warmer in most places in May, or in the northern hemisphere at least, or there's less snow in winter, or does it mean more tropical storms, more turbulent weather, more dramatic events?
It means those things and more, and I think it's very important that you put that temperature change in context of how much planets change temperature, which turns out to be not very much. At the depths of the last ice age, some 20,000 years ago, the temperatures around the world were only about 8, 9, 10 degrees Fahrenheit colder than the pre-industrial, and so a 2 degrees Fahrenheit increase since then, and perhaps another 2, and then another 2. Now we're talking about shifts in the warm direction that are comparable to how cold the ice age was. And if you think about the massive perturbations that entailed, where I am right now was at the end of an ice sheet that stretched from New York City to the Arctic Ocean. You know, the tundra was prevalent from here through to the Carolinas. That was a very, very different planet. Yeah. And we would be extremely remiss in thinking that if we go the same distance in the opposite direction, that too would not be a very different planet.
You study climate change not just as a contemporary issue, but as a recurring feature in the Earth's history. We've had periods of climate change. Can we judge from here and now, in the midst of a change that's underway, how it compares to dramatic changes of the distant past?
Well, we can. Right now, we are a geological force that's comparable to some of the biggest things that have happened since the demise of the dinosaurs. And if we continue down a path of burning all the hydrocarbons that we can find, we will leave a fingerprint on the Earth that will be the size of the largest thing that's happened in perhaps the last 60 million years.
To say the phrase extreme events, whether they're weather events or other kinds of events, came to mind for me when I read about something you wrote online about a body of water that was called Lake Agassiz, named not for the tennis player, but for the famous Swiss-American scientist. And tell us what happened to Lake Agassiz, where it was, what it was.
Yeah, so it's a great example of how interesting past climate has been. So as the last ice sheet was retreating, and it was retreating because of changes in the Earth's orbit, so it was taking a long time to retreat, many thousands of years. There was a lake that kind of pooled at the bottom of the ice, right? And we see that now in small areas, you know, around the Rockies or the Himalayas, but this was a massive. This was a lake that stretched over most of Ontario and some of Manitoba, and we can see the shoreline kind of in the ground pattern even today. And what happened was that as the ice continued to retreat further and further north, at some point the water found its way through the ice, underneath the ice, and the ice sheet collapsed, and all of the water drained out in a very, very catastrophic fashion, perhaps as fast as within 6 months, that entire lake drained, and there was enough water in that lake to raise global sea level by about 1.5 feet. So this is an absolutely
within the
massive,
space of 6 months.
in the space of 6 months.
Yeah.
Yes. So this is, I mean, it's left far field traces around the planet, and it had an impact on the climate because that amount of water rushing into the North Atlantic disturbed the currents that we know draw heat towards the north. Those currents were disturbed. There was a brief 100-year-long cooling, which we can see in the ice cores in Greenland, in cave records in Europe, in ocean sediments in the Norwegian Sea, etc. And so, you know, trying to understand, you know, all of the different processes that happened, why it happened when it did, how long it lasted, what the impacts were. We can use our climate models. We can use paleoclimate proxies to try and work out what happened, and then kind of get some credibility from being able to understand such a calamitous event to making predictions for the future for our particular event.
Gavin Schmidt, thanks a lot for being with us today, and hang around for the discussion period in about 20 minutes or so. It's great having you with us. Our next panelist is Dr. Rachel Cleetus of the Union of Concerned Scientists, where she is policy director with the Climate and Energy Program. Dr. Cleetus holds a PhD in economics from Duke. The Union of Concerned Scientists describes her project's mission as, and I quote, designing effective and equitable policies to address climate change and advocating for their implementation. Welcome and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me, Robert. Great to be here.
First, can one say flatly that we face appropriately, appreciably more extreme weather events than our grandparents or great-grandparents did globally?
Well, you know, there are some kinds of extreme events that we're certainly seeing increase in intensity and ferocity. And one of them is evident right now around many parts of the country. We are seeing these record-breaking wildfires. We're seeing extreme heat. We're seeing a mega drought in big parts of the Southwest and the West of the US. These have the fingerprints of climate change on them. We are entering a situation where the rise in the accumulated heat trapping gases in the atmosphere that's coming from burning fossil fuels primarily, but also deforestation, is contributing to this inexorable rise in global average temperatures. And wherever we live around the world, we're seeing its impacts. The United States is uniquely such a big continent of a country. We see a bit of everything. We're seeing sea level rise, we're seeing heat waves, we're seeing flooding, we're seeing wildfires. And what this means is communities across the country are dealing with this. The climate crisis is here and now, and it's going to get considerably worse if we don't rein in our heat trapping emissions.
You told me when we spoke a couple of weeks ago that the worst thing we can do is to treat all the various phenomena that you've just alluded to, for example, as one-off events, as things that are separate rather than seeing them all as related problems. Why do you say that?
Yeah, you know, there is this human tendency to call these things disasters, and it has sort of that implicit connotation that this is something beyond our control, and it's a one-off thing, it's going to happen and then things will get better. But the scientific trends, the evidence here is very, very sobering, which is that we're continuing to see not just individual events get worse, but they're starting to compound and cascade. So the hotter, drier conditions, there's drought, there's heat waves, and then you get these wildfires, and they're colliding with other problems in our society, the COVID pandemic, the economic crisis, the energy crisis. So especially for low-income folks, folks who are vulnerable, they might be elderly or very young, they might be homeless. For communities of color, particularly, who are subject to the legacy of racism in our country and might often be living in substandard housing or in places that are more vulnerable to these climate impacts. The cumulative impact of all of this is getting worse and worse, no doubt.
You told me you saw a climate change dimension to the war in Ukraine. Even do you mean Russia's fossil fuel exports that are?
Well, it's very important to think about the root causes of how we got here. Yes, this is about emissions in the atmosphere, but it's also about an extractive fossil fuel-based economy that is not just fueling the climate crisis, but is also the driver of environmental injustices in communities where this fossil fuel is being extracted. And with the war in Ukraine, what we see is crises that are connected. We see a very unjust, terrible war that's being prosecuted because of access to fossil fuel revenues. We see that this has triggered a wider crisis, a food crisis around the world because Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world, an energy crisis, and again, it is falling disproportionately to folks who have the least resources. The final thing I would say about that connection is we've seen how it's unleashed a refugee crisis. And the reality about climate change is that many, many places are getting increasingly unsafe and risky. We stand to see huge mass displacement of people around the world because of this. We're seeing the leading edge of it already. And as a society, we really have to have a human rights centered framework to deal with this so that these people who are displaced are not going to be treated with racism and xenophobia, which unfortunately has been the experience, especially for refugees of color, migrants from Africa, for example, who've been trying to escape to Europe, have been treated very differently than the current refugee crisis. So important to keep all of this in mind and take the lessons to the broader climate crisis as well.
The rationale for using fossil fuels, especially natural gas, is that it's cheap. Advocates of coal would say that if they weren't so heavily regulated, that coal too is even cheaper. Are environmental policies that address climate change necessary but expensive, and we should accept that, or are they necessary and cheaper?
But the most expensive thing we can do is continue down this path of devastation that we're on currently. Fossil fuels are not cheap. They appear cheap because they're being subsidized, and society is bearing the cost through climate change, through pollution, including air and water pollution, and the thousands of deaths that causes. So it's not cheap. And in fact, if we are to take the long view, the best investment we can make now is to transition quickly to a clean energy economy. And what's standing in the way is political will, but it's also the clout of the fossil fuel industry. It is no accident that we are where we are here today. They have been spreading misinformation and lobbying with their deep pockets against climate action.
We do seem to be, though, on the verge of entering a new age of automobiles. That is, there are changes underway among U.S. auto manufacturers, European manufacturers, and in China, all to move toward e-vehicles, electronic vehicles. And the big infrastructure bill that was passed last year, a big chunk of it actually creates charging stations all around the country, and finally eliminates, or at least addresses, one of the problems with electronic vehicles. If we saw a mass conversion over the next decade or two to e-vehicles, how big a chunk of the problem is addressed by doing that?
Look, this is the good news. We have the solution. So both in the power sector, as well as you pointed out, in the transportation sector, there are really promising technologies available in the power sector too, with solar, wind, battery storage technology, and the costs have been falling, double-digit costs year-on-year declines for some of these technologies. Two things though, we need the infrastructure to back it up. If we're going to scale up EVs, we need electric charging infrastructure, and we need it to be accessible in rural communities everywhere where people are. And it's not just about replacing vehicles one for one. We need to invest in mass transit. We need to think about how we're building our cities and make them more low carbon, compact cities, so that people can walk to many more places, that public transit is also clean, that our power is coming from clean sources, because the biggest chunk of what we're going to get is decarbonizing the power sector and then transferring as much as we can of our energy use over to that clean electric grid in industry, in buildings, in transportation. And we can do it. We have the technologies.
Well, Rachel Cleetus of the Union of Concerned Scientists, thank you, and hang around because we'll have a discussion session in the second half of our hour. Our third and final panelist is Elizabeth Kolbert. She has been reporting on climate change for the past 2 decades for The New Yorker, where she's a staff writer. She has written several books about her beat. Her book, The Sixth Extinction, won the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. Her most recent book is Under a White Sky, which is about efforts to solve the problems that she's documented in her earlier books. Elizabeth Kolbert is a true reporter, schlepping to the Arctic half a dozen times, to rainforests, deserts, other locations, to watch scientists at their work and to document the ecological crisis that we're living through. Elizabeth Kolbert, thanks so much for taking part in this not so adventurous, but I hope very enlightening panel. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
After so many reporting trips to talk with so many people who measure the depth of the ice or collect Panamanian frogs that are destined for extinction, what for you, I'm just curious, is the most important takeaway of what has become a huge chunk of your professional life?
Well, it's no surprise after having listened to Gavin and Rachel that the big takeaway is how we are transforming an entire planet. It seems impossible to believe on some level, but that is really the great story of our time, the story that I've been, trying to document all these many years, and that has taken me to some astonishing places, including the top of the Greenland ice sheet. And wherever you go, wherever I have gone, when you go with the right people and look with the right eyes, you can see or discern human impacts. And we've gotten to the point, where we could go to the top of the atmosphere and find them. And there was a Japanese submersible that went to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, which is the deepest part of the ocean. And you can go online and find this photo of plastic at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. So we are everywhere, and we have become, as my predecessors on this program said, a vast geological force, vaster than the traditional forces of nature, as it were, that have shaped geological history.
What do you say to the person who would say, I'm not a climate denier, I get that part. The age of humanity's influence on the Earth and its climate may cost us the more rapid extinction of say, the amphibians, which is remarkable. But does that really affect me, that person asks? Does it? Or if it does, how does it affect him?
Well, I think there are 2 ways to answer that question. And the first way I would answer it, I suppose, is, humans are one of many millions of species on the planet, and we get into a pretty vexed ethical territory, it seems to me, when we say, well, one species, who cares about the other species on the planet? We are all products of a very long evolutionary history. Every species could be thought of as an answer to the question how to survive on planet Earth. So we're sort of, if we're a library of those answers, we, one species, humanity, is burning down that library. I think we could all agree that burning down libraries is a bad idea. And what could be a worse idea than getting rid of the other creatures who we co-evolved with? Now, if that still doesn't move you, if you're like, burn away, I guess the other way to answer that question is, we are still profoundly dependent. Everything we eat is obviously a product of some kind of biological system. As much as we've tampered with those systems, we are still very much dependent on them. And a time that you would not want to be around, just if you were like an odds maker, is a time of mass extinction, because the impacts, the end result of that is extremely unpredictable. Ask the dinosaurs about that one.
Yes, I think you've put your finger on the problem there with the dinosaurs. You've described a cycle of warming oceans and melting ice that leads to more warming oceans and more melting ice. I just found very remarkably crystal clear. And I'd like you to describe what happens when, I guess the key part about the Arctic ice in this case is it's snow-covered ice is a very reflective part of the Earth's surface. When the share of the Earth that's covered with that changes to ocean, it sets off a vicious cycle that I'd like you to describe.
Well, this is when people talk about like the Arctic ice in a death spiral. That's really what they're referring to. That ice, sea ice in particular, is very white and reflects almost all of the sunlight that hits it. As you convert that very reflective surface, the technical term here is albedo. As you change that albedo, you absorb more heat. So water is very dark. You know, if you think of the ocean is very dark, it absorbs a lot of heat. So that's a feedback. I defer to Gavin on this one. There are many positive feedbacks in the climate system. We have not found, once again, I'll defer to Gavin on this one, we have not found a lot of negative feedbacks in the climate system. So everything that we do when we nudge the climate in one direction, it tends to amplify itself. And that is how we, got into ice ages and out of ice ages. And now we're sort of in uncharted territory. And that's why we rely on models to tell us what's going to happen. And these models, absolutely predicted that climate change would be seen most dramatically and most quickly in the Arctic, where you were doing among other things, melting the sea ice.
Yeah, by the way, every time you say Arctic, should we also think as well as the Antarctic, or is there something different going on at the other pole?
Well, the Antarctic and the Arctic are very different systems in the sense that one, the Arctic sea is sea ice, it's floating ice. Antarctica is a continent, it's continental ice. There are different issues in terms of air currents and wind currents, but the bottom line is you have to be concerned that we are not just melting the ice on the Arctic, but also melting the ice on the Antarctic. And if you really want to cause displacement and global havoc, start melting the ice on the Antarctic and watch what happens to sea levels.
It seems to me that the COVID pandemic had at least two impacts on climate change, or on our discussion of climate change. First, we got to see what happens when the industrial world comes as close to shutting down for a prolonged period of time as we can imagine. And second, we learned in the disputes over vaccines and masking that a lot of American citizens of a highly educated country regard scientific findings as opinions, about as solid as the judgment that the CIA makes about what Iraq's doing with its secret weapons programs. I'm just wondering whether your hope in proving the science persuasive was diminished at all by the experience of the past couple of years, and what did the global lockdown do to our climate for a year?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
I mean, the lockdown was interesting. At the end of the day, in 2020, when many of us were sitting at home for much of the year, global emissions only dropped. They dropped less than 10%. Mm-hmm. When you look at some of the trajectories that we really need to be reducing emissions on sort of that level year by year without all sitting at home. So I think it did illustrate sort of the scale of what we're talking about, for better or worse. In terms of the acceptance of scientific information, I think that if you've been following the climate change story for a while, you were horrified but not necessarily surprised by the public's reaction to, or parts of the public's, and the way that the debate became polarized, so that your political party predicted, whether you were going to go out and get a vaccine. You would think, Darwin would suggest that that was not possible, right? That this species that ignored potential death threats deadly diseases wouldn't really be one that you would bet on ruling the planet. But here we are, and it was a pretty sobering. If you thought that information was crucial, and as a journalist, you like to think that, you had to think again.
On the other hand, journalists, on the other hand, are accustomed to disappointment that information doesn't necessarily change the world or make it stop on a dime. I learned from reading you that there's a field called CLI-SCI, that is CLI-PSI, climate as in CLI as in climate and PSY as in psychology, analyzing the phenomenon of climate change denial. Is there any wisdom about this? About what drives it?
Well, I think a lot of people there's also a burgeoning field of dealing with people's climate anxiety and climate despair. So there's a lot of psychological research going on now, sociological and psychological research. I guess the only thing that has really seems pretty robust is that, and this really speaks to COVID as well, that people's beliefs are enmeshed in a whole cluster of beliefs. And if you try to change one of those pieces, is very difficult to do so in isolation. So once people have decided, I believe X, Y, and Z, and part of that is I don't believe I should get a COVID vaccine, it becomes very, very difficult to change that.
Well, Elizabeth Kolbert, stick with us. I'm going to call back our other panelists now, Gavin Schmidt and Rachel Cleetus, to have all three of you with us. And I wanted to let me put this question to all of you. I'd like to hear your responses. It seems to me that in talking about climate change, there is a contradiction which people hear, which is on the one hand, we have to do something. This is a disaster. On the other hand, it's too late. No matter what we do, we're cooked. And the battle was lost sometime decades ago, if not a century ago. How does one reconcile the dire condition that we're in, the advancement of warming that we've already measured, with the idea that human action might in some way mitigate or reverse the damage that's been done? Gavin Schmidt, let's start with you.
Yeah, I hear that all the time. And so one of the things that comes out of the science, which I think is very useful here, is the notion that if we were to stop emissions today, temperatures would basically stabilize. We'd still see some sea level rise and other changes, but temperatures would basically stabilize. Global warming would cease. And what that tells us is that further global warming is really a function of further emissions, and we're in charge of what we're going to do in the future. And so we're never going to be at a point where there isn't a better decision to be made. We're always going to be, whatever happens, whatever temperature we get to, there are always going to be decisions that are going to make it better or worse. And so our agency in this is very strong, and what it will happen depends on what we will do. It's not baked in, and we're not doomed. And so some of the despair that Elizabeth mentioned, I think, comes from a misreading of what has happened so far. We can still make things a lot worse, and so we have to act to avoid that.
Rachel Cleetus, your thoughts on this?
I couldn't agree more. We do have agency, and our choices really matter. So let's exercise that agency. And I do want to say that this is a decisive decade. We can always make better choices, but the choices we make in this decade will be profoundly consequential for our children and grandchildren, for people around the world. So speaking for myself, we have no right to give up, because what we're giving up is on behalf of ecosystems and generations to come. And we have to fight with every fiber of our being for every fraction of a degree we can avoid. And I just want to say, part of the strategy of our opposition, who are interested in their narrow profit motives from fossil fuels, is to make us go into despair and hide in a corner. So please don't give into that. It's worth fighting. It definitely is.
And Elizabeth Kolbert, how do you reconcile the dire conditions you report on with the notion that our actions are important, our response to this is important?
Well, I think what's really key, and Rachel and Gavin have put it eloquently, is we are going to decide the fate of untold generations of humans and non-humans. We are deciding that. We're deciding it without deciding, unfortunately. I think it's I will say, I guess I'll push back a little bit. I think it's a very difficult political message to say we can make things a lot worse, but we can't make them better. We live in a society that is sort of, has a Hollywood ending where some hero swoops in and everything is going to be fine. And unfortunately, the message is everything is not going to be fine. It's already pretty unfine. If you're sitting in New Mexico today and the fires are raging around you, it's not fine. That's not going away, but the mess, unfortunately we have to grow up and we have to confront the fact that we have some really, really, really serious problems, and our choices are to make them so terrible that our children and grandchildren will really, really fight. And I don't think it's an exaggeration for a habitable, planet, or we can give up and just, consign them to that. Those are the choices, and they're not happy choices, but that's it. And we got to get to work.
I think for people who imagine a Hollywood ending, the most popular Hollywood ending among people who think about these things is a technological Hollywood ending, that there's some new technology that could be developed that could either very effectively combat the changes we've seen, or actually alter the weather and change the climate despite what we've done to it. This is something that you address in your reporting. How much of a role does technology potentially play here?
Well, I guess I'll take that one for the
please.
Technology plays a role in anything, a fantastically important role. We're not getting off fossil fuels. We're not going back to cutting down trees, or at least I hope we're not, because that would also be disastrous. So we're relying on very sophisticated technologies, which are solar power and batteries and wind and potentially nuclear, another debate. So those are all 21st century or late 20th century technologies. And then we get into a techno-futurist world. Are we going to get fusion power? Are we going to get so much free power that we can start using it to take CO2 out of the atmosphere? Then do theoretically get back to some pre-industrial climate. Now we are really talking, I see Gavin rolling his eyes, but I don't think, that these are short term, but, maybe if we were all to magically come back, 50 or 100 years from now, maybe that's the situation that we would be in. And maybe that's a narrative that would inspire people. I don't really know.
Gavin, give us the linguistic version of what you're rolling your eyes about.
That wasn't really rolling my eyes, but Elizabeth is absolutely right. Technology is playing a key role in not just changing how we create energy, but changing the need for that energy and what we do with it. Take this example here. We have 4 or 5 people united across the internet, doing an event that costs a tiny fraction of the energy that it would have taken had we all met in person somewhere together. We can re-envisage how we do things. We're not, and this goes back to that same point that you raised earlier. Are we forced to always do things the same way that they have always been done? And I think part of the happier ending for this is for us to reimagine what it is that we want to be doing and rearrange things so that we're doing them much more at a much lower cost to the environment. And so there is change in energy technologies, there's change in transportation technologies, but there's also changes in how we organize ourselves. And I think, part of the visioning of how things can be better in a future world, despite the climate changes that are happening, is that we will move in that direction, towards a world with more justice, towards a world with better urban environments, with more connectivity, with better options for people.
Yeah, I just to jump in briefly there, the world that we live in right now is supremely unfair in many ways. If you think about this terrible heat wave that's unfolding in Pakistan and India, many people don't have access to air conditioning. They don't even have access to grid-connected electricity around the world, millions of people. So we could move to a world where many more people have access to basic necessities, even as we're getting more clean energy. The current system as it stands is not perfect. It has embedded in it all of the socioeconomic inequalities one can think of. And so when we think about a better world, a more climate resilient, a lower carbon world, it could also help solve for these other problems. And the latest IPCC report that just came out on mitigation makes that very clear. We can align our climate and sustainable development goals in a way that actually solves for multiple problems. And that's what we should be looking for.
Although couldn't one say in response to that during this same period, the Chinese have been bringing people out of rudimentary agrarian lives into urban lives recognizable as a working middle class existence, and they've brought them out by the tens, if not hundreds of millions, and indeed that consumes a lot of energy to right some of the economic injustices in the world. That working a rice paddy, all of your life is not a promising career.
The data on this is really stunning because as the latest IPCC report points out, wherever you look in the world, it is the richest people around the world in countries that are responsible for the vast majority of emissions. The United States alone is responsible for a quarter of heat trapping emissions that have accumulated in the atmosphere. On a per capita basis, the United States is one of the worst offenders. So yes, as more people come out of poverty, their energy footprint might increase slightly, but it's nothing in comparison to what really luxury lifestyles in the West, but also the richest people in other parts of the world are contributing to the carbon challenge. So the inequities are baked into the climate challenge from the very beginning. The global carbon budget has been used up in a very inequitable way and continues to be used up in an inequitable way. So we need to understand that luxury emissions versus necessity emissions should matter in how we solve this problem.
And Gavin Schmidt, I don't know if you have thoughts on this.
Well, I mean, I just, very clearly, let's be clear and make a distinction between the need for energy to construct, to sustain cities and technology, and the need for fossil electricity, which there is no need. Right, so emissions and energy can be decoupled, and when we talk about this, and when we talk about bringing people, up to a much better level than where they are, that does not require fossil fuels. I mean, the distributed grids that you get with wind and solar in the Indian subcontinent are going to be a much more direct way of bringing power to rural communities that are never going to be on a national grid there. Right, so there's many ways that we can find win-win solutions that don't exacerbate both the climate problem and the inequality problem.
Well, let's return to what Elizabeth Kolbert alluded to. So we might as well go to you, Elizabeth, which was nuclear. It is, for decades, the assumption has been that the nuclear energy is not a solution; it's a problem. Does there come a point when we say its carbon neutral properties outweigh whatever risks we have. We'll ship nuclear waste off into space and let some other planet worry about it. But where do you stand on nuclear energy?
Fortunately, I'm a journalist, so I can duck that question. I mean, I think it's a very, very difficult question at this point. I know very smart people on both sides of this issue who would say, yeah, if you're going to have nuclear power, you're going to have nuclear accidents. And in the vast history of the world, that's better for the world than what we're doing to it right now. And then there is an argument to be made that, that's just, you cannot consign future generations, once again, to radioactive waste that is going to last for many, many thousands of years. The Finns are putting up a nuclear waste repository, a long-term storage facility. We in this country do not have a long-term repository, even though we've had nuclear power now for 60 years. We can never agree on where to put it.
There's been a debate over in Nevada that's been going on for, I think, almost my entire life.
Exactly. And it will continue for the rest of your life. And they had to figure out, how do you try to communicate to generations that will no longer speak Finnish, that, may come from who knows where, that there's dangerous, stuff down here. So these are really, really, really difficult questions. And after Fukushima, it became even more difficult. Many countries, as everyone knows, moved actually to shut down their plants. But in some cases, maybe rethinking that now, because the options seem in some cases to be worse. And it's a really tough one.
Nuclear energy, Rachel.
Yeah, I know that this has become the seeming litmus test of whether you're serious about dealing with climate change or not. I'm confused by that, because honestly, the reality on the ground is nuclear hasn't been able to deliver on the scale that folks had hoped for. Just look at the example right here in the US. Just in the last week, the Vogtle plant, which is being built in Georgia, the developers have come in again saying that the cost is now going to be closer to, I think, 34 billion, which is like twice what they said it would be to begin with. And they've got another huge delay. So if we're talking about cutting emissions in half by 2030, let's get serious. This technology is not, even though it's been around for decades, just isn't able to economically deliver. And this is not for lack of subsidies. Lots and lots of subsidies have gone the way of this industry, including now in the infrastructure bill, which includes a subsidy to keep existing nuclear plants online. So as existing nuclear plants are retiring early because they're being outcompeted in the market, unfortunately, they're being replaced by natural gas, which increases carbon emissions. So to the extent that they're operating safely, and that's a key piece, there might be a need for incentives to keep them online. But new nuclear has been really a disappointment in the United States, despite the fact that there are a lot of cheerleaders for it. And this is not just a US story, it's a global story. It's been hard to get new nuclear power plants online. So I would say let's not have magical thinking about this. If we really are going to cut emissions in half by 2030, let's quickly deploy the technologies that are actually scaling up fast, including bringing online more offshore wind. And again, UCS is not pro or anti-nuclear. We are definitely safety watchdogs and have been ever since our inception over 50 years ago. We're just looking at the stark economics of the situation here, and the track record is not great.
Gavin Schmidt, do you have thoughts about?
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of both of those thoughts. The price of renewable energy has been plunging in recent years. The price of solar, wind, battery technology, all of them have decreased enormously from as we've gone from research to deployment. The costs of nuclear have gone up. And so part of the economic headwinds that industry has felt are because of that particular economic reality. There are interesting things in the pipeline. There's talk of this fourth generation nuclear energy, smaller modular things that could be scaled up that would have diminishing costs. But right now, now, that seems to be more of a research goal than an applicable reality. And so, given given the need to reduce emissions very quickly, I would not be somebody that says you have to close down all the nuclear plants. I think that there is, as Rachel mentioned, there's an argument that we should keep existing safe plants open as long as we can, because they do provide firm electricity that is being used. But it doesn't seem to me to be a technological savior in the sense that you first alluded to in the intro there.
I've been asking you about climate change, how it got this way, and what we might do to reduce it. But let me start from the other end, which is Elizabeth. We're experiencing climate change and more extreme weather events. What should we be doing on the mitigation end to assume that we will have them, that global warming, at least for now, is with us, and we don't want Superstorm Sandy to be a model that can overwhelm a city without a fight? You've reported on New Orleans, which is one of the most those of us who've ever done a story there about the disappearing coast of Louisiana. It's stunning to see what was done with the intention of making Louisiana wealthier and making the Mississippi a better river, only to completely destroy the environment of the state. What if we were to do things to try to mitigate the damage from global warming? What should we be doing?
Well, there's an interesting linguistic problem because we're mitigating the damage, but this is what's usually classified as adaptation, right? So we want to mitigate emissions, but it's a terrible, terrible tangle, and I won't get into that. But anyway, we need to be, absolutely, we have, guaranteed a certain amount of damage. We're seeing it in a lot of places, in fires and in sea level and in floods. There was a video that kind of went viral today of the house on Key, I guess it was on off North Carolina, just tumbling into the water. And we need to, and we're very bad at this because this is another political quagmire. Some places are not going to be, we should not be rebuilding. In some places, we should be, managing that process of moving people away from very vulnerable areas. And unfortunately, those are getting bigger and bigger, and it's a very, very difficult problem. But, in places like New York, they're already building sea defenses, and they're going to be talking about massive sea defenses. Whether those will ever get built, I honestly don't know. The problem that we also face in this complicated, adaptation mitigation race here is unless we really zero out our emissions, we have a constantly changing climate. So what are we adapting to?
You have to keep on redesigning the wall to be taller and taller and taller.
Exactly. So I think that those two, activities, as it were, go hand in hand. We have to have the agreed upon, we have to bring down emissions as ASAP. So we will have at least a much more, stabilize the climate somewhere. And we have to try to do our best to reimagine our coastlines and other forms of management to try to minimize, and this is not going to be easy, the damage from the warming that we're already experiencing.
Rachel, Cleetus, what do you are you part of this argument that we shouldn't think in terms of adapting, that it's giving up the fight?
It's both and. At this point in the climate crisis, it's both and as the IPCC reports pointed out, this is what it's going to take. We can't adapt to runaway climate change. We're going to have to cut emissions and adapt because climate change is already here. But unfortunately, in many parts of the world, many places, many people, many ecosystems are already running up against the limits of adaptation.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean, dieback in the Amazon, loss of land that Elizabeth was talking about. So this is a serious matter. We have not invested enough in it globally. So there's a real need in developing countries for there to be more money available. And one of the issues in international climate negotiations is the issue of loss and damage, which is the fact that many places are facing existential threats, existential impacts for which adaptation isn't possible. Small island nations, low-lying nations like Bangladesh, and richer nations who are responsible for the vast majority of emissions need to put some money on the table, and so far have not been willing to do so. So this is a big topic of conversation around climate justice at the international level.
And Gavin Schmidt, you have, as it turns out, the last word on this subject.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I should be brief. There are two. There's one very big difference between mitigation activities and adaptation activities, and they require different kinds of solutions because of it. So mitigation. If I reduce carbon dioxide emissions, right, that can cost me perhaps, but everybody benefits, which means that there's a massive free rider problem. People want me to do it, but they're not necessarily willing to pay for it themselves because somebody else will pay for it. Whereas adaptation is often, the people that have spare capital to build into adaptive policies, they will do it and they will benefit. And so the incentive for cities, for localities, to invest in adaptation is very clear if they have access to capital and if they have not reached the limits of adaptation. And that's been the thorny issues. These things are not commensurate. They don't play off against each other, but they are very key things that we need to be doing we need to be doing both, but we need to be thinking about how to do them very differently in each case.
Well, thanks to all three of you, to our guests, Dr. Gavin Schmidt, Rachel Cleetus, and Elizabeth Kolbert. And also thanks to Joshua Plout, Nate Bonzani, Roni Giuliano, and Adrian Kiss from American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, which produces Global Connections. And also thanks to our technical director, Sam Lunetta. Our program sponsor, the American Friends of Rabin Medical Center, is a 501c3 national charitable organization which represents in the U.S. Israel's largest hospital, Rabin Medical Center. It's in Petach Tikva in Greater Tel Aviv in Israel. The website for the organization is www.afrmc.org. I'm Robert Siegel, and this is Global Connections, Navigating the New Normal. See you next month. Stay healthy and stay safe.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.